we say we should focus on development, and last week there was a report that was launched by the UN on data for development.
Yeah.
And increasingly, that's what's happening. Developmental partners and even government agencies are beginning to rely more and more on data. Digitalization is the big thing also now. So we are moving from a lot of legacy information that we have collected and then migrating them onto digital platform. That is part of the development we are talking about. I'll give you an example. In healthcare, there are sorts of interesting proposals that are coming for them to change all this disparate paper information they have. Digital. There's all these government platforms that are coming up for single storage of information, which requires you to digitalize all the information. And there are all these interventions that are based on technological solutions. So we are on this path, and we need to get the foundations right, which is why I say it's two sides of the same coin. So we are focusing on the development, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to see how others have done it elsewhere. And we've seen that sometimes you play catch up, because if you do not embed all these privacy requirements and protection of people at the beginning, you find yourself far down the line and then you realize that you got something wrong.
Hello, welcome to the Digital Rights Africa podcast, where we discuss all issues pertaining to data protection, privacy, intellectual property, child online protection, and data governance across the continent of Africa. Today, we have been joined by Samuel Bartels. And Samuel, it's a pleasure having you here.
I'm very happy to be here too.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm a lawyer, but not the usual kind of lawyer. I'm not all suits and wigs and all that.
Thank you for insulting us.
During the day, I'm Senior Manager for Regulatory and Government Affairs with the lead telecommunication company in Ghana. During the evening, I teach at the Ghana Technology University College. I'm also in the media as a sports pundit, but generally, I'm just a person who loves to learn and is curious about a lot of things.
Okay, that's interesting. So I have brought you here more in your capacity as someone that has worked in the tech space, more particularly telecom space, and you've had a brush with data protection law in Ghana and maybe across Africa. And I want you to share a bit of your journey around data protection compliance from where you sit.
So let me start with how I got mixed up with this in the first place, and you know part of the story as well. I think my attention was first drawn to the issues of data protection, especially how important it was. Whilst I was studying at Queen Mary, University of London, studying telecom regulation, at the time also information privacy. This was also at the time where most of the consultation for the GDPR was happening. And Europe was trying to flip the 1995 directive. So I got very interested in that because at the time, I think here we were still at the incipient stages. You were in charge, trying to get policy makers to be alive to what this is. It was at that time, people could not conceive what it was. It was a big deal in Europe, but not in here. I remember reaching out from across the sea and saying hi, all these things. So that's how I got into that. And I think the initial stages was really to gain knowledge and understand what this is. And so, from the academic perspective, you come at data protection from a human rights perspective, that there are laws, people have a right to this. I say people have a right to be left alone. And then from that came the world of IAPP, getting certified and finding out what's happening in other parts of the world, becoming familiar with the regime in the US, which is a much more fragmented regime. And then looking across Africa, trying to find what was happening on the continent and understanding just how big a challenge this was with our inability to find something that works across. And then when I got into corporate, then you had to move from not just a human right perspective, but then also find yourself approaching this from a compliance perspective.
From a business.
From a business perspective. So now you are in the middle of a balancing act.
Okay.
Because the economic benefits, the use of
Exactly.
information, people have the right to have their information protected, among other things. So that's been my journey up to this point. Being able to harness all the different perspectives of information privacy and data protection and finding what works and which will keep the ordinary individual happy, what will make a company able to achieve its objectives without in any way breaching regulations or the rights of the subscriber. So that's how my journey has
Does
been.
that exist? Because I'm curious about that. Have you found that balance as a compliance person that is working with one of the top communication companies in Africa?
I'm still trying to find the person who has found that balance, because there's no perfect balance, and there are many reasons for that. Even within the typical corporate settings, you have the risk aspect of the business, which is keen on avoiding any kind of exposure, any kind of breaches, and anything that puts the business at risk. Then you have compliance, whether it's first level or second level, saying that what do the laws say? And it's what we are doing in compliance with what the law says. And then you have commercial interest, which is that how do you, and normally that commercial interest comes from a very good place, which is you have a customer.
Persuade me.
Customers are constantly demanding better products, better services. Now we've moved from that point where products were developed as one cap fits all. To a point where now people want more tailor-made solutions.
Okay.
So something like customer value management has now come up, which means this high-value customer uses, these are their usage patterns, etc., etc. So you have a whole lot of information.
So you want to send me ice cream when I haven't asked for
Precisely. No. Because I know you like ice cream.
At the time you think I want it.
Precisely. And generally, that's been the evolution with people who provide products and services. But in providing that product and services, now comes determining even at the beginning whether there are any risk to using the information, whether you are in compliance in terms of using the information. And then ensuring that beyond everything, there's a data governance framework that addresses all the needs of the business and still keeps you within the boundaries of data protection.
How does that work?
So that works first with people understanding what the responsibilities are to people who hold data. And first understanding what kind of data you have and the risk associated with that. I think for a very long time, people have defined data in a rather wider context. Data is data. But then, of course, in this case, we are talking personal data. So there's data that sits with companies that they can use for strategy and everything. It has nothing to do with the individual, whether they work for the business or their customers. But then here we are talking about personal data. What do you have about this person? Now, once you have that, then comes sitting down and breaking down your data and finding out exactly, because a lot of companies have data, but they are not too sure where it sits.
Exactly.
Disparately across. Where does it sit? Who has access to this particular information at any point in time? And what governance exists? And the third factor becomes a crucial factor, because even if it sits in disparate places, if you're able to map where the data sits and you have a governance that ensures that there's a single view of what happens, where the data travels to, where it is used, that then becomes a starting point. Then everybody else involved understands how they interact with the data, what the opportunities are and what the restrictions are. That ensures that nobody crosses the line. So it's like the governance process becomes the drawstring that puts everything together. And then you have, so this is internal, which you may have a lot of control over. Then there's the external factors that you don't have a lot of control over. like law enforcement agency requests.
Yeah.
And getting those stakeholders to also understand that it's a balancing act. And so a lot of times you find that the law favors the states. So
Yes.
national security comes, everything is national security.
Of course.
What can you say if it's national security? But making them understand that there are those that are mandatory, and if the law says so, I don't have a choice because it's on the pain of punishment as an organization. If a warrant comes in, it's on the pain of offending the court, so I don't have it. But then there are also the discretionary ones, which a person may not have the legal backing for, but which is in the public interest. So where there's a kidnapping, for instance, where do you draw the line between the timeliness of the release and going through the process and regularization? And that's one of the more difficult parts, getting government agencies, security services to understand the obligations that come with these things. So yeah, that's how we go about it.
I mean, from where you sit, I just want to understand, because you sit in an organization that sits on a lot of data and valuable data, so to speak. And you've kind of like drawn a very complicated scenario around, what I'm looking at as highlights to your compliance, right, as an organization. And so how has it worked, Is it a very complicated process? Is it simplified? How do you really walk through this to just make sure that you have that overview?
So the breakdown, the mapping, the framework helps to simplify the process. It's at the beginning that it would look very complicated because of where all this information sits. But thankfully, because of tools and certification requirements and all that, it helps you in that journey towards simplifying it. So, for instance, company I work for is ISO 27001 certified.
Yes.
That comes with certain basic requirements.
Okay.
And so in terms of the cybersecurity side and the protection side, those standards being implemented takes away your worry about breaches, at least from the system side. So your CIA of the information is sorted out. Then comes, once you have your processes and everything sorted out, the other big challenge, which is the human beings.
Yes.
So I guess all the research points the fact that you could have the best systems, but if the human beings do not understand and make mistakes, then comes having to make every human being in the organization, as much as possible, understand the value of what they do, access it, not abusing it. Because here in Ghana, typically, I'm sure people would face temptations like somebody calling to say, can you get me this, or can you check this for me? When the person understands that there's a process, and under no circumstances should the process be circumvented, that helps.
Okay.
And once they understand it, then at that level, you have a certain level of compliance as well. And then your processes become something that is known to everybody. And that's the beginning of the process. I've made it seem quite easy now. The challenge is that it's a moving target.
Yes.
And you can never rest because you are dealing with technology.
Yeah.
People. And you are dealing with people.
Yeah.
And you are dealing with regulators.
Yeah.
Who change the laws all the time. So we have the latest of them, which is the Cybersecurity Act.
Okay.
Which has come, which contains certain provisions, which has created a new authority.
Exactly.
Which now has its own requirements, which has created the establishment of certain entities as critical infrastructure,
yes.
With certain obligations that come. So that also modifies what you do in terms of your reporting to the external environment. And then there's the business itself, which might evolve as a model.
Yeah.
And there's all the people within the business who are constantly developing ideas.
Yeah.
So whenever new ideas are developed, which have a nexus to your customer information, what then happens? It means you go back and you review what you have in place and find out if that framework, the usage, all that you have will still work and will still keep you in compliance, will still mitigate your risk. So yeah, it's an evolving process, but all it means is that you constantly have to gauge and check your obligations as well as your corporate practices to make sure that it is in tune with the times and it's in tune with all the changes that are happening technologically around you.
I know a lot of people say that, you know, all these things really, we are harassing ourselves. Our continent is, should be focusing on development, providing basic needs for people, food, education, health, housing. Those are the things we should be focusing on. What do you say for somebody who's in industry? And I know sometimes industry says that, which of course you've iterated here, we are lumped with, overwhelmed by all these laws and requirements and obligations and all of that. What would you say? To be or not to be?
I think it's two sides of the same coin. You can't have it one way and not have it the other. If we say we should focus on development, and last week there was a report that was launched by the UN on data for development.
Yeah.
And increasingly, that's what's happening. Developmental partners and even government agencies are beginning to rely more and more on data. Digitalization is the big thing also now. So we are moving from a lot of legacy information that we have collected and then migrating them onto digital platforms. That is part of the development we are talking about. I'll give you an example. In healthcare, there are sorts of interesting proposals that are coming for them to change all this disparate paper information they have. Digital. There's all these government platforms that are coming up for single storage of information, which requires you to digitalize all the information. And there are all these interventions that are based on technological solutions. And so we are on this path, and we need to get the foundations right, which is why I say it's two sides of the same coin. So we are focusing on the development, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to see how others have done it elsewhere. And we've seen that sometimes you play catch up, because if you do not embed all these privacy requirements and protection of people at the beginning, you find yourself far down the line and then you realize that you got something wrong. So I think it's extremely important for us here in Africa to get these things right. For instance, now we have a national ID that contains everybody's information. We are even doing things like same registrations, having common databases and all that. If we do not get it right, do our risk assessment, make sure there are controls in place, make sure there are safeguards in place. You collect all this information and realize that maybe a third party that you use, because you didn't lock them in with the right legal requirements, is out there repurposing your information or using it for some other purpose. So those are the regrets we do not want to have. Because yes, we want Africa developed, but we want Africa developed in a very modern way, which means you can't do it without technology, you can't do it without digitalization, and you certainly cannot do it without requirements for cybersecurity and data privacy.
Thank you. That's quite deep. So data protection is not cheap.
No, it's not.
So how do you, from where you sit, we have a wide spectrum of people or industry players that are required to comply. How would you advise they approach it? And is there a way around, cutting back on the cost?
I think I always say that we should look at the cost in two ways. Cost based on what you spend to enhance your governance practices. And what you lose and spend if you do not do the initial spending and you suffer a data breach. I think one of the biggest things that is hard to recover is reputation. And now reputation is inexorably linked with showing that you are unable to take care of the things that people have given to you.
Entrusted to you.
You are in custody of people's information. You just need to provide service for people. It means you are holding it in trust for them. People will give you value if they can trust you. And that's why they keep coming to you. If you cannot guarantee that value, they would go over to somebody else. And so data protection is a badge of honor with which to even differentiate your product and market to people. To say, you can come to me. You're safe with me. I provide the service, but you can sleep in the night knowing that I'm taking care of you. Now, when you look at it that way, then you would spare no expense trying to get things done.
Yeah.
I mean, it starts with having to, I tell even small businesses, why don't you just register? Merely telling somebody that I'm registered with the Data Protection Commission is a plus. Then comes training your people.
Yeah.
And that will cost something. Then acquiring systems. Now, because of organizations like OneTrust and all that, there are all sorts of tools.
Yes.
And that's because it's no longer a matter of Excel and PowerPoint presentations.
Yes.
There are tools that become one-stop shop that help people. And fortunately for us, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If it's been done and tested anywhere else, you just have to find a solution that works for you.
Yeah.
So investing in the license to use a tool would also come at a cost. Getting certification with ISO and other certifications have now become mandatory. So under the Payment Systems and Services Act, it mandates you to have one of these certifications to guarantee that your practices assure a certain level of safety. So you'd have no choice at all than to do it. So it doesn't come cheap, and this means you have to renew it every year. The training has to be every year. I remember you reaching out and saying you need to bring some of your people to do training.
Yes.
And the reason why it's important for these people to do that training, because they can't be gatekeepers and not know the latest in this, and not have a certain level that gives them legitimacy, which is why you'd have to train. And then comes refreshing that knowledge and constantly participating. So why would it be important for people to want to come to Data Protection Summit, Africa, or anywhere else? Because the peer review allows you to know whether the things that you are so confident works for your organization are still relevant, and to gain new knowledge and to get new skills, and probably even get people who can help you do better. So I guess in short, I think I hope I've made a good enough pitch as to why it's worth the spending.
I think you have. I don't know whether people have the money to be able to make that expense, but definitely it is a very important thing. And personal data itself is expensive. So if I'm entrusting you with my information, I definitely expect that you will be putting in place, the right kind of measures.
And now there are lots of free materials that people can source and do the most basic things. It doesn't have to be complicated. Not every organization is as big as what I work for. But so you start with the strength of what you have. But the most important thing is to have a framework and a practice in place.
I agree.
That puts you on your way to securing
I agree. Oh, wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. You have to come back again. I'm hoping that we can be doing exciting things around enforcement and other things. So, Samuel, thank you very much for joining us today. And you should come back, join us again soon. If you've joined us, thank you for staying through this podcast. We will come back to you again with a Digital Rights Africa podcast sometime soon. Thank you. Have a good evening.